right. First of all, Dr. John B. Alexander, a little bit of background on him educationally. The University of Nebraska at Omaha, BGS in Sociology, 1971, Pepperdine University in 1975, an MA in Education there. Walden University, a PhD in Education in 1980. University of California, Los Angeles School of Engineering and Applied Science Engineering Management Program in 1990. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Sloan School of Management, Executive Program in Management of Complex Organizations in 1991. And Harvard University, John F. Kennedy School of Government, Program for Senior Executives in National and International Security, 1993. Dr. Alexander has been an investigator of and a developer of non-lethal warfare systems. He is an absolutely fascinating person, and I trust that we have him on the line. Dr. Alexander?
Great.
Good. We've got you. You know what I think, Doctor? I think I should allow you to introduce Colonel Corso. Many people will not know who Colonel Corso is. They might know he's got a book called The Day After Roswell, and that might be about all they know. What would you say of Colonel Corso beyond that?
Well, I first met Colonel Corso about a year ago, and he came to us with a very unusual story, and that had to do, of course, with alien technology and the things that he has written about in his book. One of the things that struck us, of course, was his credentials, and of course sometimes people fake them. So I spent a week in Washington checking out his background.
Uh-huh.
And I went to the Pentagon, the National Archives, the Army military history. I also went to the Army War College, because a key person in all of the things that he talks about is a Lieutenant General Art Trudeau. And Trudeau in the Army and military at all was a legend. In fact, he was so well known that when the Army started doing their oral histories, he was one of the first 8 people to be interviewed. Now, where this gets important is that during this interview, Phil Corso sat in every session with the general. So here it is, 20 years after they both retired, and they still remained very close friends. And one of the stories is he actually got his boss fired at one time, which is not usually career-enhancing, but survived that and remained to be very close friends. So what I can say is when Phil says he was in the National Security Council, he was in this Foreign Technology Division in the Pentagon, it should not be confused with the thing at Wright-Patterson. This was a small Army thing. Basically, it was Phil, and a position that he held until he retired, looking at foreign material, and of course he claims that this, some of it at least, was from the crash saucer.
So it would be fair to say the colonel is a former Army intelligence officer.
That's true.
All right.
He worked in with a heavy background in research and development.
Anyway, I've got a little bit more on the colonel, and I'd like to read it. Former intelligence officer, yes. Part of the Allied occupation forces in Rome from 1944 through 47. At the end of World War II, Operation Paperclip, which brought German rocket scientists to the United States. During the Korean War, he served under General MacArthur, and from 1953 through 57 as a member of the National Security Council under President Eisenhower. It was in 1961 that Colonel Corso was appointed chief of the Army's Foreign Technology Division. It was then, on a certain fateful day, as the colonel tells it, that a file cabinet was wheeled into his office, the contents of which he was asked to examine by Trudeau. Corso was advised the contents were not, quote, run-of-the-mill foreign stuff, unquote, and was suggestively told to research the Roswell file before writing up his summary. Among the items in the cabinet, the colonel says he found a mysterious shoebox of tangled wires, a dull, grayish, silvery foil-like swatch of cloth that he was unable to fold, bend over, tear, or wad up, but that bounded right back into its original shape without any crease. I wonder if any of you recall from the movie that exact description. Visually, you saw that material in the movie Roswell. And though it was a dramatic reenactment, that was obviously very much like we have described here. And that is just the beginning. So there are many, many questions. All right, let's see if we can bring him on. Colonel, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, we don't yet have Dr. Alexander back, but we definitely have you. And what I'd like you to do, if you'd be willing, is to add to what Dr. Alexander said and tell us about your own background.
My background, well, I came in the Army in 1940 when the war started, right after Pearl Harbor. And I was drafted, and I went to officer school, and I came out as second lieutenant, and they put me in an artillery outfit. And right after that, I got transferred to intelligence. And I was sent to England, got promoted to first lieutenant, and I joined British MI-19, and they sent me to Cambridge for 3 weeks, and I learned intelligence under them. And from there, I went to North Africa. I became an interrogator, prisoners of war, and worked with the British and with their commandos. Then I went to North Africa, and from North Africa, I participated in the landing at Salerno Harbor in Italy. Then I came up through Italy all the way to Cassino, and I was in the battles of Cassino. And from there, I landed on the beach at Anzio, and then went into Rome. And there, they made me Assistant Chief of Staff, G2 Intelligence, and Intelligence and Security Chief of Rome Area Command. And I participated there in reestablishing law and order. I destroyed the Gestapo and SS nets. And from there, I came back to Fort Riley, Kansas.
So your career, to the point that you met the general, was a very honorable and fairly normal military career.
It was in combat at the time. We were fighting a war in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. And then I joined the general. I went to Korea after that. I participated in the Korean War, and I joined MacArthur's staff over there. And I came back. When I came back to the States, I joined President Eisenhower as one of his military aides in the National Security Council at the White House. And there my career sort of changed. I was in the White House for 4 years. And from there I took command of a missile battalion, the Army's missile firing range at White Sands.
Mm-hmm.
Then I took a combat missile battalion, and I had atomic warheads even, to Germany. And I stayed in command 18 months, and then I became Inspector General of the 7th Army. And from there I came back to the United States, and General Trudeau had reorganized research and development of the Army. And he sent for me, and I joined him as a special assistant and chief of the Foreign Technology Division.
So you had a very, very long military career before you met General Trudeau.
Yes. Well, I met him when he was chief of Army Intelligence, and he sent me to the White House.
Okay, but at all this prior military service, Colonel,
yes.
You never laid hands on any sort of extraterrestrial anything, or even had a hint of it. Everything you did was
I didn't. Not till I got to Fort Riley, Kansas.
Was very terrestrial and very normal and very heroic.
And very normal, yes, it was.
And that's where, I guess, with General Trudeau, in what year?
I joined him. First, I was in Army Intelligence, and he sent me to the White House. So I stayed there for 4 years. And then I came back to the United States in 1960, and I immediately joined him in research and development.
What did you do at the White House, Colonel?
I was on the policy. The Operations Coordinating Board was the policy guidance system. It investigated policy and made policy. And we were known as checked up on policy. And I actually chaired a lot of policy groups. And President Eisenhower, he he, for example, assigned me a case was called the Volunteer Freedom Corps, where we're going to set up units in Germany, like Polish and Czech and Romanians flying a uniform with the uniform of their nation, and we were going to harm them. And he wanted to put this, and I worked on that and put in. We were ready to put it in effect, and then he had his heart attack, and it went sort of downhill. CIA opposed it, and State Department opposed it, and I found out later that they used deceptive methods to oppose it.
All right. Dr. Alexander, you went to Washington and basically confirmed all of this background?
Yes, and there's probably a bit more. As I said, this is high-level intrigue, but it turns out that it's really true, and that is that General Trudeau, as the Chief of Staff Intelligence, Army Chief of Staff Intelligence, the highest intelligence guy in the Army, was fired. And
why? Or maybe I ought to say for what?
There's high-level intrigue going on, and supposedly he had passed information to Adenauer, which the Dulles boys, who had CIA and state, were quite unhappy with.
Now, I was involved in that, and I can fill in the background if I guess John wants to do it.
Well, go ahead. You've got a better feel than I, Phil.
Yeah, okay. Well, what happened is I brought General Trudeau what we called the National Intelligence Estimates. These were the basis for U.S. policy, and they were made by CIA.
And, Colonel, the comment was made that you got your boss fired.
Well, possibly I caused it. I was a trained intelligence officer by the British, and we had at the White House what we called National Intelligence Estimates. All were top secret. They were basis for U.S. policy. CIA made them up, and they were supposed to be compiled from hard intelligence.
This, Colonel, is the kind of thing that today you would see somebody walk in and put on the president's desk in the morning. That sort of report?
Well, it was sort of. But this was a basis for policy, and later would become national policy.
I might add, Art, these are very comprehensive reports. These are based on long-term projections. A number of people look at them, and they are... The intelligence community gets together and say, this is our best estimate.
So are these, in effect, not daily intelligence reports?
No, they're not daily.
But summations that lead to a firm policy change for our government? Most
of the estimates that I uncovered were vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and Communist bloc.
Uh-huh.
And I found out, since I could check intelligence from the military sources, I found out that they were not based on intelligence. It was mostly ideology, and just 2 years ago, CIA admitted this in newspaper articles. For example, I went to the general one day on the loss of Formosa, and I told him there was a national intelligence estimate on that. It was not important, so the general called CIA, called Alan Dulles, and he told him no such estimate existed. And I pulled the copy of it out of my briefcase and handed it to him, and I won't repeat what the general said. Now, these estimates, I found out that they were not based on hard intelligence. They were based on their thinking and ideology. And this was dangerous because most of them were apologetic to the Soviet Union. And we considered that a great danger. So when I laid these out to the general, and by the way, in 1962, I testified for 2 days in front of a committee of Congress, a Senate and Judiciary Committee, and this testimony is still rated top secret. It was on this subject. And Trudeau refused to comment on these overnight like they wanted, because they didn't want anybody to check on them. So they made up an excuse that he gave when Adenauer called him in Washington, and he briefed Adenauer on these cards. Well, I got in the act, and I sent over to Germany, the CIC, the military, and I told them, get me information that Galen's outfit is penetrated. And they did. So Alan Dulles immediately took off for Turkey. And I still remember that's where he went. And two of my friends, former ambassador of Thailand, Max Bishop, and ambassador to South America, Mexico, Robert Hill, came with me. We went to see Senator Bridges, at the time chairman of the Armed Services Committee. and he was a tough old man. And he promised us that there won't be another officer promoted in the Army until Trudeau was brought back and promoted. And he did. He got promoted to lieutenant general. So this was the intrigue that went on, and of course this increased my animosity with CIA, because they didn't like an intelligence officer uncovering this.
I'm sure.
And remember, at the time, I was at the White House, which was considered above them. So I could call a few names back when I wanted to. And there was not much I could do about it. But this was the intrigue where General Trudeau was relieved, and then brought back bigger than ever. In fact, he took command of a corps, then came back and reorganized research and development, which was in logistics, a secondary mission.
All right, who was responsible, do you think, for bringing General Trudeau back?
Yes, because we were close. Until the old gentleman died, we were close friends.
No, I understand that, but what I'm asking, Colonel, is who was...
Thurman.
What was that? Who brought him back?
Yeah, who brought back General Trudeau?
Well, Secretary of the Army Brooker, and a couple of generals, the chief of staff, who was, at the time I forget his name, but he was a friend of the generals, and they brought him back, and he became chief of research and development.
But it was because of Strom Thurmond and the support from the Hill.
Yes.
So Congress is integrally involved in this.
That's right, they were. There were strong senators, Senator Eastland, Senator Dirksen, Senator McClellan, and Senator Thurman, and Nolan, and people like that were involved on General Trudeau's side. And I know because I talked to everyone on personally. And
so they wanted him then as chief of R&D, and I take it despite all the political intrigue earlier, they knew him to be a patriot, they knew him to be a good man, and they trusted him, and I presume that's why they brought him back.
This was a general that took his helmet off with 2 stars. He was a division commander at Port Chop Hill, and went up and fought with his men. He put on a sergeant's helmet.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a major general, a division commander. That's the type of man he was. And also very religious. He went to retreats at Loyola, and one of the most brilliant men I ever knew in my life.
And so naturally, as he came back, so did you with him.
Well, I came back from Germany, and when he found out I was back, he sent for me. And I walked in his office, and I saluted him, and he said, "You aboard, Phil?" I told him, "Yes, sir." He said, and the only order he ever gave me was, "Phil, watch things for me, the rest don't understand." And what he meant, the inside workings of the government. So that was the story on the general.
Okay.
Because he challenged the estimates, which were a danger to us. Because the Soviet Union at the time has said, we will bury you.
I recall.
Yeah.
So...
By the way, a defector told me that he was talking to Brezhnev in Germany and in Russia. There's a defector from Poland named Goloneski. And I asked him if he ever heard of Trudeau. He said, "Oh, yes." He said, "Brezhnev told me," and Brezhnev was premier then, he said that this is the most dangerous general in the U.S. Army. A defector actually told me that. Michael Goloneski.
And from what point of view do you think he meant that, the most dangerous man?
He meant that also as a fighting general, and because of his knowledge also in R&D and intelligence. He knew what they were up to.
All right, this is obviously going to get fairly complicated, and with all our phone troubles, we've made our way to the bottom of the hour. So everybody just relax for a few moments. Back now to, respectively, Dr. John Alexander in Las Vegas and Colonel Philip Corso. Gentlemen, you're both back on the air again. All right, so now you went to work for General Trudeau, and this is where things begin to get interesting for you.
Yes.
At this point, again, you had never laid hands on anything extraterrestrial, probably hadn't seen a UFO or anything else. In other words, you were not any sort of ufologist or even interested.
I saw a body at Fort Riley, Kansas, but I put that out of my mind until I could corroborate information, like in intelligence, and prove it. And later there were some experiences that happened. My radars were picking up objects at White Sands when I commanded the range battalion, traveled 3,000 or 4,000 miles an hour.
I guess that most all bases had an on-duty officer for the military.
Because I was a security officer, I had to go. Baby or something. Then I got a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Under 5 feet. Audio was low. I don't know what. Maybe later. And later on, I was able to prove what it was.
Do you know what that liquid was?
No, I had no idea.
Uh-huh. And you say there were a total of 5. Is that correct? 5 caskets or 5, if that's what you want to call
No,
them?
they were crates-like, but they had a liquid in them. The thing was floating in some sort of liquid.
Okay, what date was this, as best you can recall?
It was Fort Riley, Kansas.
And the date?
1947. It was in July.
July.
Because I went to Fort Riley, Kansas. I was stationed out there with garrison duty. We had an intelligence aggressor force we were setting up for the military, and we were writing courses for intelligence. And I joined the Department of Non-Resident Instruction at Fort Riley, Kansas.
All right. Since you're an eyewitness to this, and you're now 82 years old, is that correct?
82.
It's very, very important that we be very clear about what you saw there. This is a very key point, I believe. The Air Force, as you well know, had a news conference and said, well, they were dummies. Now, is there any chance that what you saw, and in fact, as you know, the Air Force at their news conference showed these dummies that they dropped in later years, 1953 actually, but even if they had dropped them in 1947, they might have, could you have been looking at a dummy, a non-being?
I told people in late interviews that I will not criticize the sister service, and I won't, because I fought in Korea with them, and I have a lot of friends in the Air Force, but their superiors I will criticize. There was no question in my mind what it was. I know the difference between a body like that I saw there and a dummy, or even a monkey like some said, and then they've even come forth and said maybe it was Japanese in that balloon. I don't know where they get these stories or why they make them up. It's beyond comprehension to me. They don't have to do this.
So you saw a creature. There's no question about it.
Yes.
I take it, Colonel, you saw the Air Force's news conference, correct?
Yes.
And you saw the dummies that they showed that were dropped, correct?
Impossibility.
And that is not what was in that...
No chance.
No chance. All right. Do you know where these bodies were next headed?
I do know. When I came out, I asked the sergeants on the guard that night.
Right.
I asked, and they said, we talked to the drivers. It came from an air base in New Mexico. There was 5 trucks, and they were heading for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The boys, they had a driver and a co-driver, each truck, and the soldiers told the sergeants that, and they reported that back to me. It was on its way. And remember, in those days, about one of the only cross-country roads was Route 40. And they were coming through Route 40.
Right.
And they were heading for the Air Force Base in Ohio, Wright-Patterson. And the soldiers told them that. That's where they were going.
All right. Do you think that anybody else, the soldiers accompanying these caskets or whatever they were, also saw these beings?
Well, the sergeant did that I was with, that came in with me, and then I told him to get out because it was sensitive.
Where is that sergeant?
I can't answer that.
Okay, where is that sergeant now? Do you know?
It's been 50 years, Art. I don't know. I wish I did know, because he was a good boy, you know.
Well, he may be
a master sergeant.
A master sergeant at that time.
Yes.
So he may or may not still be with us.
That, Art, I can't answer. I don't know.
All right. So there you saw it. You saw this body, and then what?
Then I sort of forgot about it. And then when I became the missile commander at the range in New Mexico, I started picking up these objects traveling 3,000 and 4,000 miles an hour. And I started checking that, and our headquarters didn't want to be informed. So I didn't say much.
They didn't want to be informed?
No. I thought I send one forward. See, on the Nike system, I had tapes. They looked like a lie detector thing. And that gave the entire firing sequence. So when one of these events happened, I would call the battery and said, send me the tapes. And this showed if it was true or not. And they actually were accurate. And later I discussed this with the radar people. And then when I went to Germany, I was picking up, every once in a while I'd pick up an object over there going 3,000 or 4,000 miles an hour.
And nobody wanted to hear about it?
No, our headquarters, when I sent them the first report, they said, we're not interested, forget it. So I promptly forgot it, and I didn't report it any longer.
Dr. Alexander, does that make sense to you, or for that matter, Colonel, does it make sense to you? Then, certainly, we had not made any statement saying UFOs are no threat to national security, we're not interested. It would seem to me anything flying at 3,000 or 4,000 miles an hour would have been of intense interest to the military then, or for that matter, now.
Not necessarily. And when you look at things like NORAD and places like that, if you don't believe that there is a threat that can go that fast, and you then say, and you're looking for threat or no threat,
right?
And if it doesn't exist, even if it goes that fast, it's not threatening you, it's no threat. And we were looking for every reason to discard targets, not to try and include them. Remember, computers were not like they are today. I mean, you've got more power on your desktop today than NORAD had in those days. That is true.
And I suppose...
My computers were the cam type. We had a needle that revolved around the cam. Then I got... Those came from England. Then in my tour, before my tour was up, I had radars, and they were oil data pots. And that was quite an advancement in those days.
And it was, of course, primitive, throw out a bunch of RF and get a return type radar. There was no transponder usage or anything like that. So you were constantly looking at what really was in the air.
Yes. On my radars, even in Germany, I had 2 batteries always on alert. And we were tracking these things. I had an acquisition radar, and then I had 2 target track radars. There was a pencil beam, which would lock on the aircraft and lock on the missile. One on the aircraft and one on the missile. Mm-hmm. And the computer would bring them together. Now, when you fire Nikes, the missiles we had, we lock on the target, and then the missile, when it's fired, goes straight up in the air and then dives on the target. And it does not fire slant range. This was the Nike system that we had, which was the best that we had at the time.
All right. Dr. Alexander, as you went back to Washington, again, you confirmed the colonel's service in these areas as best you could.
That is correct. No, he absolutely was the places that he said he was and when he was there and did what he says he did. By the way, Art, one other thing I think ought to be made that I think is important about Phil Corso is this is not the first time that he has come forward and told some pretty remarkable tales. In fact, in I believe it was 92 or 93, talked about a secret war that had been going on. And this was done, reported in 2020, U.S. News and World Report, and to the U.S. Congress. And it was a war that had been going on, and Phil can tell you more about it because it's an important piece of why we responded the way we did. and except for those who had very special clearances, never knew that this was going on.
What secret war are we talking about, Doctor?
We were, for many, many years, we were probing the Soviet air defense. And we would send planes in and try to get them to turn on their electronics so that we could map their air defense system.
Sure.
It was a cat and mouse game, and every once in a while the cat won. And we were losing air crews, and we knew, and Phil can tell you a lot about this, we had people down on the ground, captured, alive, and we didn't even ask for them back.
Sure. What year was that, John?
Oh, this went on for decades.
But with regard to the colonel's involvement?
Well, he was in the White House in the 50s when we had lost some of them.
Also, we had a 100-inch camera, which was highly classified at the time. From northeast part of Korea, it could photograph Vladivostok.
Really?
And this was highly classified at the time, and we were flying that over there. Now, Chris Wallace on prime time, he asked me one day when I was being interviewed on TV, Cold War, and I told him, Chris, I don't want to be ludicrous or it's not a joke. I'm very dead serious on this. I don't know of any Cold War. Every war I've been involved in was a hot war.
Mm.
And I told him, and boys were dying, they were shooting at each other, 30-millimeter shells and everything else coming at them.
Colonel, how many aircraft and air crew are you aware of that we lost during those kinds of operations?
I don't have the number, Art, but this went on for quite a few years. And it was a constant battle. And we lost a lot of men. In fact, I had a situation where when I testified in missing prisoners of war, a woman came out to me with her daughter, and they gave me the name of Lieutenant Colonel. I said, oh, yes, I remember him. He was a technical advisor on one of these airplanes with a 100-inch camera, and I used to receive the reports or the photos. The little girl got over and kissed me on the cheek. She said, finally, we don't know what our father did when he got killed, because the Pentagon told us he was joyriding. I told him he was not joyriding. He was a technical observer. Now, these things happened, you know. And Chris Wallace, and we walked in front of the White House, and he took some photographs. He had his cameraman there. And he stopped and he said, Colonel, I understand. After all, you people are responsible for the security of the nation. I told him, Chris, I'm glad to hear that you understand what we were doing.
Well, I understand that it had to be done. It is a little difficult for the American people to understand that when these air crews went down, even if they lived, they were basically abandoned.
Yes, they were. I testified in front of the House Committee and the Senate Committee on this problem.
What do you think happened to those men, Colonel?
I told President Eisenhower what happened to for example, at Panmunjom. I was on a truce delegation, and I was on the ground when the boys were being exchanged. A Korean colonel we had told him, civilians told him, there was 500 sick and wounded 10 miles from Panmunjom. I wrote this up. Well, then our prisoners came through, and those boys told me that they saw those boys there. They were sick and wounded, pretty badly sick and pretty badly wounded. So I wrote up a presentation, and the chief delegate took it up at Panmunjom. The Chinese general broke a pencil in half when he heard this. Now, none of those boys came back, and they were all dead. They all died. And this was 10 miles, yet I told the Senate committee for this, they didn't ask me one question about it.
Well, maybe they didn't want to know.
Well, I think the answer to your question is that, particularly for the technical people, that after they fulfilled their usefulness, they were terminated.
Terminated. In other words, no doubt the ones that ended up in enemy hands were tortured for whatever information could be gleaned and then disposed of.
Right.
Well, they also took their identities. That was the intelligence aspect of what I discussed with President Eisenhower.
I wonder how people who have knowledge of this, Colonel, sleep at night. I mean, do you just rationalize it's war?
Well,
cold or hot, whatever you want to call it, it's war, and there are casualties.
It was war. And after all, they threatened to bury us, and they were a threat to us, and we had no choice, just like the extraterrestrials. In the military, you think you always just in case it's hostile, you're not going to be caught short.
Mm-hmm.
And we did the same thing in extraterrestrials.
All right.
Just in case, we're going to be ready.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about that. You saw a body in 1947. There's no question about what you saw. You know what you saw.
Yeah.
It then went on to Wright Field in Patterson, and that really was the last contact of that sort you had until when?
Well, there was these planes were flying at Red Canyon there, and some things happened there. But then what confirmed it really in my mind, the collaboration, which is no question, we financed a laboratory at Walter Reed. Research and Development did.
Yes, sir.
They had autopsy reports. They had one, and they did autopsy reports, which I had in my file.
You had autopsy reports in your file?
Oh, yes. In fact, some of that's mentioned in the book. And I described the extraterrestrial. Actually, the way I described him in the book, that one of the reasons when we tried to make flying saucers and they all didn't work, was the extraterrestrial himself, or it, whatever it was, they had no sex organs.
Uh-huh.
He was a clone and built specifically by some intelligence for space travel. He was actually a part of the flying saucer. He was the guide system.
So technically he was part of the craft.
Yes, he was part of the craft.
Uh-huh.
And he was the guidance system.
Colonel, if I may, how did they make that determination? In other words, all they had, or maybe I'm wrong, was dead bodies. Did they have any live?
Not that I know of.
Not that you know of.
But we know with electromagnetism, and remember, I had some von Braun scientists on my team. I discussed this with Herman Obert at Petamunda. He was von Braun's boss, and he believed in space travel and dimensional travel even. And I discussed this with von Braun and my own German scientist. I had two on my team to investigate the line of atoms and metals.
Good morning. My name is Carol Rosen. In 1974, after being a sixth grade school teacher, I was introduced to the late Dr. Wernher von Braun in the U.S., the father of rocketry. In my first meeting with him, during that first 3.5 hours, he said to me, Carol, you will stop the weaponization of space. And I said, teachers don't stop until June. He said, no, you have to understand, this is February, and we have to prevent the weaponization of space because there is a lie being told to everyone that the weaponization of space is now first being based upon the evil empire, the Russians. There are many enemies, he said, against whom we're going to build this space-based weapon system, the first of whom was the Russians, which was existing at that time. Then there would be terrorists. Then there would be third world countries. Now we call them rogue nations or nations of concern. Then there would be asteroids. And then he would repeat to me over and over, and the last card, the last card, the last card would be the extraterrestrial threat. Well, at the time, I kind of laughed when he said asteroids, and when he said extraterrestrials, I knew I wasn't going to deal with that subject. And now we hear on the news just today, this week, that they've slid in another enemy. Only this time we're going to protect our satellites. In other words, we have to have some reason to spend these trillions, to waste these dollars on a space-based weapon system, and they're all lies. This is a system, he told me, that would never protect anyone. Even back then, he talked about suitcase bombs. He talked about chemical, viral, bacterial, biological warfare, that these space-based weapons would never protect us against. And then he told me that, in fact, if you travel around the world, which I did after he died in 1977, I met with people in over 100 countries who were friends. They didn't want to build space-based weapons. I became a space and missile defense consultant. And I worked with people around the world. I became an advisor to the People's Republic of China. They don't want to build a space-based weapon system. And he told me back then that they didn't. He said, go to Russia. They're considered to be the enemy. I got on a plane by myself. When I got to Russia, I had a list of people that I had read out of the newspaper. Chernenko was in office then. He was the only one I didn't get a chance to meet. They introduced me to everyone when I got there. And when I got back, I said, oh my Lord, this man is telling the truth. Is no threat, and I've been waiting until this day for 27 years, and I'm expecting the spin to happen, because he also explained to me that as a military strategist, as a person who worked on the MX missile, which I did later, he said, you will find that there is going to be a spin to find some enemy against whom we have to build space-based weapons. And now we should expect the spin, because he said part of the formula for the intelligence community is if they might have a weapon, then we have to consider that they do have these weapons. So now they do have these weapons, so now we have to build these weapon systems. And that's the formula, except that it's all based on a lie. And we have witnesses here today that have shown you that these extraterrestrial beings, that these craft that have come here are now not UFOs, they're identified flying objects, and we know that they have beings in them. And we have witnesses here who have told you that they can shut down our missile silos, they can stop a rocket going into space that's a test. We have witnesses here who have worked in the classified departments, who have the courage to come forward here to support what Wernher von Braun told me back in 1974 to 77. And I will testify before the Congress that when I founded the Institute for Security and Cooperation in Outer Space, which I shut down a few years ago because I didn't believe we had a chance with this huge, integrated around the world, complex weapon system, that we had any chance at all of transforming that war industry into a space industry that could provide benefits, like Dr. Greer has said, of global warming. We can end that situation of that problem. We can end the energy crisis. We can build now non-polluting technologies. Wernher von Braun used to tell me that we could have cars back then that drove around off the ground. He described this to me on beams so that we have no pollution on this planet. And we can solve the problems of the people that are urgent and potential, and the other animals and the other cultures on Earth and in space. And we can end the arms race without dislocating the industry jobs, without disrupting the economy, by transforming, Wernher von Braun told me, the war industry into a global cooperative space industry that will provide, he said, finally, more jobs and profits on this planet than during any hot or cold wartime, more products and services that can be applied directly to solving the problems of this planet. And we can have a whole planet now that lives in peace on Earth, with all the cultures on Earth and with all the extraterrestrial cultures in space. And these are words that Wernher von Braun told me in 1974, and I will testify before the Congress under oath about everything I have said and more. Thank you.
The reason we are coming forward now is that we are asking for the U.S. Congress and for President Bush to move towards an official inquiry and disclosure on this subject. It has the most profound implications for the human future, for the U.S. national security, and for world peace. Specifically, technologies connected to UFO and extraterrestrial vehicles, if declassified and used for peaceful energy generation and propulsion, would solve the looming energy crisis definitively, would end global warming, would correct the environmental challenges that the Earth is facing. It is also critical that we begin to debate as a society the propriety of placing weapons in space. If indeed, as we can prove, it is true that we are not alone and that space is territory which we are sharing with other civilizations, it could be a very imprudent, destabilizing thing to place weapons in space. This is not being debated because it is off the national and international radar screens. It needs to be placed on it, and we are here today to do it.
It is time for America to take the next steps. Today I announce a new plan to explore space and extend a human presence across our solar system. We will begin the effort quickly, using existing programs and personnel. We will make steady progress, one mission, one voyage, one landing at a time. We'll invite other nations to share the challenges and opportunities of this new era of discovery. The vision I outlined today is a journey, not a race. And I call on other nations to join us on this journey in a spirit of cooperation and friendship. We have undertaken space travel because the desire to explore and understand is part of our character. And that quest has brought tangible benefits that improve our lives in countless ways. Probes have shown us stunning images of the rings of Saturn and the outer planets of our solar system. Robotic explorers have found evidence of water, a key ingredient for life, on Mars and on the moons of Jupiter. At this very hour, the Mars exploration rover Spirit is searching for evidence of life beyond the Earth. Yet for all these successes, much remains for us to explore and to learn. Beginning no later than 2008, we will send a series of robotic missions to the lunar surface to research and prepare for future human exploration. Using the Crew Exploration Vehicle, we will undertake extended human missions to the moon as early as 2015, with the goal of living and working there for increasingly extended periods of time. Eugene Cernan, who is with us today, the last man to set foot on the lunar surface, said this as he left: "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. America will make those words come true." As one family member said, "The legacy of Columbia must carry on for the benefit of our children and yours." The Columbia's crew did not turn away from the challenge, and neither will we. Mankind is drawn to the heavens for the same reason we were once drawn into unknown lands and across the open sea. We choose to explore space because doing so improves our lives and lifts our national spirit. So let us continue the journey. May God bless.
So, Mark, we just heard about Mars, and then the president was in Roswell, New Mexico. What's going on there?
All right, back now to my guests, both in Las Vegas, Dr. John Alexander and Colonel Philip J. Corso. Now that you have come forward, Colonel, with this incredible information, surely there are others, other than General Trudeau, who has now passed on, who could confirm what you're saying.
Lately, I had 4 officers come up to me in uniform.
In uniform?
Officers.
And?
They confirmed, 2 colonels confirmed to me that this was true. They knew about it. And a lieutenant colonel came, and the test pilot from B-2 came up to me in uniform.
In uniform?
Yeah, I don't want to say where it was because I don't want anybody looking into it. And they verified this to me just 10 days ago.
They're not prepared to come forward, though.
No, and I did get a letter from, and I don't think if I tell his name, he's McDonald's son. the scientist, and he confirmed to me in a letter he wrote to me before I left home. When he sent me this letter, he talked to people. He was on the Jason committee, and he said that Hughes, North American, and Wright Pat, people who are confirmed that finally they said he filled in some of the holes that we wondered about all our lives.
John,
it just came to me in a letter a few days ago.
John Alexander,
Right.
Dr. Alexander, with what resources you've had, what aspects of this have you been able to confirm?
Well, what I can confirm is, revolves around Phil's background.
All right.
That, as we mentioned earlier, he had come forward twice. We actually only mentioned one of the incidents, one, kind of the secret war that was going on. The other was a POW exploitation program that the KGB had run for 50 years, and that came out last year. And so he has twice told very unusual tales and turned out to be true. When I have talked to folks who, as I said, knew him, they state they cannot confirm the details of this, but state we should not disregard him.
Colonel, can you confirm that reverse engineering was going on at either Area 51 or Area S4, those areas out here in our Nevada desert that you are now very close to?
Now, from information I had, yes, it was going on. But I don't have the details and never bothered to try to get them because I figured that was a sister service. They're military. In fact, General Trudeau went up in front of Congress, and he was testifying, and he recommended and stunned everybody that instead of turn it over to NASA, to turn everything in space over to the Air Force. And people were stunned when he said that. And he actually said this in front of the Senate committee. So we didn't bother with them. They were doing their own work. We trusted them, and we let them alone. And we figured that it's best that we stay where we are to ourselves.
All right, to this day, how compartmentalized do you believe it is? For example, do you think the President and our current National Security Council are now in the loop, or is all of this still off to the side and a government, in effect, within a government that harbors this information?
Well, the government, when you talk about the government, it's a huge organization.
Of course.
And I said in some of my interviews, leave the government alone, it'll cover itself up. And that's true. That's what happened. It happened on my POW reports, the missing POWs I sent from Japan. Kissinger, even and Scowcroft said those reports didn't exist, yet they were there. We found them later. People didn't want to do anything with them. When you touch UFOs, people run and hide for some reason.
I know.
And I guess it's still going on. Because I've been attacked, minor attacks, so nothing of any consequence. And even Whitney Sabert, the man who wrote Communion?
Yes.
He told me, he said, Phil, at Roswell, he said, Phil, some of the attacks are we're treading on their territory.
Oh, that's right. That's how you know you begin to get attacked. Do you believe, Colonel, that the Foreign Technology Division may still be involved in seeding this technology into industry? Because we didn't figure it all out back then.
I can't say. I'm not clear anymore, and I haven't been in contact for a while. Although people tell me, like these people in uniform just told me a week ago, it's still going on. So I hope it is, because it's important enough to keep on going. And I think some of these developments, I surprised my son one day because we build airplanes, these Rutan-type airplanes, and a B-2 came over an air show, and I told him what to do, and he called me. He said, "Oh, no, it can't." Then he called me up, and he said, "It came over and it flew like a little airplane. It held near impossible for a big airplane like that." That means some of the developments are going into that craft. It has to be.
Say, Art?
Yes, John.
On FTD, and again, this was an small Army organization, not the one at Wright-Patterson with the Air Force. One of the things I was able to confirm is that when Phil came to the Pentagon, this unit was created, and right after he left, it disappears. If you follow, what I did is go through the phone books for that period in the Pentagon.
So you were able to confirm that division at that time?
At that time, and then it disappears as he retires. And right after Trudeau left, because remember, he was working directly for Trudeau. And right after, a few months after General Trudeau retired, that's when Phil Corso retired.
Yeah, I retired 6 months after he did.
6
like
months.
General Beach, he gave me my last decoration, the Army Commendation Medal, for what I did with General Trudeau. But I still stayed in touch with General Trudeau.
And 3 years ago he died, releasing you from your vows to him.
Yes.
And then what made you decide, Colonel, to write this book? I mean, you...
Well, one of the reasons I decided to write it, my grandchildren, the 3 little boys, asked me one day, what did you do during the war, Granddad? So I figured I'd better leave them a legacy and put it on paper, because really I never had any intention of writing a book, you know. That wasn't my area at all. And I started to write. And I put it all down, including my Italian experiences and even other investigations that I did in the government. I started to put those on paper. I figured at least I'll leave them for a legacy for the little boys. And from there it evolved into this book, which I never expected to see that.
Colonel, if you had not written this book, you're 82, you're not going to be around forever. None of us will. Would we eventually, in your view, know about all of this? Would there be anybody to come forward, or would eventually all those who can tell the story you're now telling?
Well, I think that most of them are gone, really, now. Remember, most of the people that were working with me were my age. They all had been honed in combat, and that's how we were able to keep the secret. There was a certain affinity between us. And I think that they're mostly all gone because a good percentage of them are older than I was. In fact, in the testimony, when I testified in front of Congress on missing persons, I told because the families were sitting there, I said that when I met the boys, Pamela and John coming across, they were younger than me, maybe, and I'm 82 and I'm still here. Maybe some of them are still alive. Of course, it was a long shot, but at least there was some hope for the families.
Sure. At one time, Barry Goldwater asked General LeMay about seeing the secret room, some secret room at Wright-Patt Air Force Base.
Yeah.
LeMay told Goldwater, actually cussed at him and said, never ask me about it again.
Yeah, that's right.
Was Goldwater unknowingly referring to your room?
No, he was referring to Wright-Patterson.
Wright-Patterson, where those bodies went and where you presume...
I knew Goldwater. I used to go up his office and talk to him.
Uh-huh.
In fact, I notified him when his private line had been tapped by CIA.
Did he ever ask you about this
No,
technology?
he never did. He didn't know I was involved. And I never told him. The only one that knew really on Capitol Hill was Thurman knew, and Senator Eastland knew. But those were the only two. And McCormick knew. I forgot about McCormick. I was great friends with John McCormick, the Speaker of the House. He knew also.
He knew.
Because I went up to MIT with him and gave a lecture, and the speaker was a grand old man, and he was a good friend of mine. We got along real fine. So he knew. I told him about it.
One wonders, and it is reasonable to ask, Colonel, why you are the only one who has come forward this publicly with this information. It's incredible.
I don't know. Maybe I don't know any better. I don't know.
Colonel Corso, what you have said, what you're saying in your book and here on the air, is so incredible, so fantastic, that you would have to imagine that there would be elements within the government and out of it that are aware of your information, and there must be some kind of battle going on between the people who know about whether it should become public or not. I mean, this affects all of our recent history, Colonel. Is there a battle going on? Will there be others? Are you the last? What do you think?
No, I've had calls from some of them. They'll come forward in time, but I can't expose their names without their permission. Now, also another thing, Art, I really don't think that this is going to cause any panic or anything, because I think from what I saw at Roswell when the families brought their children up to meet me, they're accepting this. They wanted to know, and they're accepting it, and they're going to go right along with it and live with it. I don't think there's going to be any great explosion or any panic. I think they're accepting it as a thing of the future, and I think it'll end up that way. And that's the way I hope it ends up. This is part of history. It's written now. the young ones accept it, and mostly I want the young ones to accept it because we won't be here that long, but they will still be around. And I think that's what's going to happen to the book. It's going to be accepted. It's what they wanted to hear.
Hey, Art?
Yes, Jim.
Can I interject kind of an administrative thing? We haven't had a chance to talk. I might mention, I said that Phil is high energy, and I think we can see that, but he's now in 17 hours today.
I understand.
So, but it might structure the kinds of questions you want to answer in this segment.
All right. There's news breaking tonight. This may seem funny, but it's not. They have constructed the world's tiniest guitar. It's about the size of a single blood cell, 20 times thinner than a human hair. It has 6 strings that can be plucked, but they are actually too small to be heard. Is this kind of... Actually, scientists at Cornell University carved the guitar out of crystalline silicon to demonstrate the possibilities of building devices at the microscopic level. Could this be technology derived from this same group of artifacts, Colonel?
It could be, because some of the things in there make a little sense, that you just said. And the first transistor I saw was almost out with microscopic little wires in it. It came from the flying saucer.
What happened to all of those materials, the ones that were not turned over to industry? What happened to those materials?
I really don't know. I left my files there with all my papers when I retired, because after all, it belonged to the Army, and it wasn't mine.
You were a good soldier. You didn't take anything you're not supposed to take.
I was supposed to be the man who would stop people from taking things like that. I was one of those. And I couldn't betray the trust that the general had in me. And also, I never had any intention of writing any books or doing anything like this. It never entered my head in those days.
Well, how did you come then to write the book?
Well,
I mean, did you struggle with it? Did you?
No, not so much. When I decided to do it after the general died, and the children, my grandchildren, asked me what I did during the war, I not only wrote this, but I wrote my experiences in Italy, like I said, and I wrote about other investigations that I worked on, and I wrote all this as a legacy for the children, for my grandchildren. Yes. And then this book here, now it started to develop from those writings. I figured I might as well discuss this too. General Trudeau's been involved, you see. So I started to put it on paper, and when I got it all done, it was actually Simon Schuster already asked me if I'm interested in getting my notes that this book was taken from published, because the notes is a different type of people, that will be looking at that, and not people that want to hear the story.
All right, Colonel, I asked you this on Dreamland, but I think it has to be asked again. On Dateline, I think it was Dateline, at the very end of the interview, you said something that people used to discredit your story. You said you would tell them sometime about a time machine, or something about a time machine.
Yeah.
Can you clear that up?
Well, I discussed that with Hermann Obert, the German. I think it's in the book. And that in time, I think, will be clarified, because there's other countries that are working on things of that type. But at the moment, I think I'll just leave it the way it is, the book, that those were discussions with Hermann Obert at the time.
All right. If you had items from a crashed UFO in your office, did you at any time consider the possibility that there was potential danger, radiation, whatever else, on handling these materials?
Well, we considered that on the chip and the integrated circuit, like I told you, that we might be leasing something on the world which we didn't understand. You see, Art, I tell a lot of people, don't think that we were so intelligent that we knew what we were doing all the time. We didn't know what these things would do and how they would end up. Even fiber optics, we never knew how that would work. We didn't even know if it was wires at the time.
Yes, sir.
But gradually it evolved and developed.
All right. If our military, since 1947, has had the only physical evidence, or at least some physical evidence, of the existence of alien ET spacecraft, which would be considered certainly a reasonable threat to national security, why has the military shown no interest in civilian UFO reports?
Well, there's another thing, where you'd have to split the military up. Which part of the military doesn't want to see it, and which part does want to see it?
That's a good point.
Because we were the opinion, we were military, we wanted it out, and we gave it out. Some of the Air Force people were the same way. other factions in there don't want to put it out because they're afraid of being labeled kooks and so forth. But I think that gradually some of the new developments I've seen, I think, refer back. Now that wing, that B-2 flies, there must be something on anti-gravity in there that I know about. But I'm not sure of that because I haven't seen it myself, see. And I never bothered. If it's classified, I'm not cleared any longer. I can't go and find out about it. But sometimes I hear from friends of mine, you know.
When you were given this file cabinet, how long did it take for you to realize what you had on your hands?
Oh, I'd say that I gave General Trudeau the entire plan within a couple of months to start developing, how we should start the development. And then gradually, as I looked at the things and conferred with scientists and other people, I began to see which courses to take. And I'd recommend those to the general, and then a decision would be made. Of course, the general made all these final decisions. See, I didn't.
What is it like for you now, Colonel? Are you getting a lot of criticism?
No, very little criticism.
Very little.
In fact, already some debunkers and skeptics have come up to shake hands with me. So there is very little criticism. In fact, I'll tell you, Art, I had some misgivings on how I received out there. People meet me in restaurants at the airport.
Right.
Because I'd never lived this type of life. I've always been sort of in the shadows, you know.
Sure.
And I had misgivings. In fact, I made the statement out there a few times, and Michael Letterman caught this when I told him. I told him, you know, when I see all this, I figure, what am I doing here? I should be home in my easy chair. Because really, never been in this arena before. But now I'm thrown in it, and I guess I've got to make the best of it.
To your knowledge, since those early crashes and retrievals and the technology and the bodies and all the rest of it, in the years between then and now, do you have any knowledge of additional crashes?
Yes, I had knowledge of that.
Oh?
The Germans confirmed it. Wilbur Smith, the great Canadian genius, confirmed it to me in person, right in the Pentagon. He came to visit us. I had a good session with him. Then the general came back from his meeting, and he told Wilbur Smith, he said, you and the colonel have a lot to talk about. I'm going to send him up to your laboratory. I was supposed to go up to Mayborough, his laboratory in Lake Ontario area. Of course, I put it off. And when they did call to go up there, they told me Wilbur Smith in 1962, when I was going up, he had died of cancer. So that was a great loss. Then the general got a hold, and I told the general that. He said, sit right down at the table, and you write down everything that you discuss with Mr. Smith, because he's gone now.
Well, Colonel, you're getting up in age, 82. There are no doubt contemporaries of yours out there, probably around the same age. A lot of them may be listening to you right now. What do you want them to do?
Well, at the right time, let them come out, because this information should be told to the younger people. And I'd like to see them come out and do like I did. Tell the young people this. They're the ones who are going to be around. We won't be around here. But let them know what you know. And I think, and I know some of these men, if they're still alive, I think they will do it. They were tough men. They were good men.
Back down to my guests. Dr. Alexander, I've asked many questions, and if there are any critical questions that you would like to ask the Colonel, you should.
Well, of course, I've had quite a bit of time to do that.
Yes, you have.
Before we checked him out, I guess a couple of things I would say. You know, one of the questions that comes up is this guy crazy? And we frankly, I don't know if he knows this, but had somebody qualified to do that, interact with him, and came back and said, you know, we may not agree with him, but he's not crazy.
Sometimes I question that myself, John. When I look back at these things, I have to question that.
Your information is so very serious that I would imagine a congressional committee or a Senate hearing would like to sit you down and make this public. If you were summoned to Washington, to tell this story, to get it out in a public forum, would you go?
I've appeared in front of 6 congressional committees.
Public?
And I have nothing to hide if they're serious in what they want to do.
Public, Colonel? Public?
Yeah, they were public. No, one wasn't. The one that that in 1962 was still classified top secret. That's the one I discussed with Attorney General Robert Kennedy. No, that's still secret, but the others are unclassified. You see, congressional committees a lot of times are not serious about what they're doing. It's done for publicity. And I know I was on Capitol Hill. If it's publicity, I won't do it. If it's to inform the people, yes, I'll be glad to go in front of a congressional committee.
Dr. Alexander, do you think there's any likelihood that in light of this information becoming so public, such a hearing might be held?
I would not be terribly hopeful, frankly, and I've been checking some sources. I know a number of people on the Hill and staffers and people who work it. Face it, the political downside for a politician to get actively involved is much higher than the benefits to be gained as long as the media reports these things the way they do.
Well, that might be true, certainly, of UFO reports or people asking questions about lights over Phoenix or all the rest of it, but when you've got somebody the stature of Colonel Corso, with what he has said and where we confirm he has been, saying the things he's saying, it seems to me it demands an investigation, and that any senator or congressman could not be too heavily criticized for wanting to hear from Colonel Corso.
Well, here's the thing, Art, I can explain. My last testimony was in front of Congressman Dornan's committee on the missing prisoners of war.
Right.
They had a Czech general there. And the Czech general his life had been threatened 3 times because he said these experiments come. And so Dornan asked me if I would appear and run interference for the general, appear before him and sit alongside of him, because I would add credibility to the general who they were trying to smear, because he was Czechoslovakian.
Yes.
And the man told a true story. And I confirmed what he said. It was true because I knew about those hospitals. I knew about those experiments. Now, it took a man like Dornan who had the nerve to get up there and hold a committee. And the families were there that day, too. They were waiting for me outside in the hallway when I came.
Yeah, there's one thing Dornan has. It's that kind of tenacity.
Yeah. And so it needs that kind of tenacity and somebody that will take it in spite of criticism. Because it's very simple. A newspaper reporter will say, well, this congressman is getting into a kooky subject. All right, some people maybe in his area where he gets votes will believe that. So why should they take the chance? I wish they would, but I doubt it. I know enough on it.
Remember, Art, there's a huge political downside. While Phil says he has not had a lot of overt criticism, that's because the book, I think, is fairly new and people are not directly threatened. If you elevate this to congressional hearings, you're now a direct threat.
Well, that's what I was hoping for, John. Some sort of direct threat to a lie by omission. I mean, it's about time. If what the Colonel says is true, then he's our best connection to what really has occurred. And here's an interesting question for you, Colonel. If all of the technology that was gleaned from Roswell and any other crashes that have occurred, alien technology, had not been interwoven with American industry, where would we be today?
Well, I'll give you a little example. I had a file in one of my files, it was in the second drawer, which was called Project Rainbow.
Yes, sir.
This was von Neumann's. You remember John von Neumann?
Yes.
It was his project on artificial life. Now, I went through that file 2 or 3 times and I always put it away when I could have started an operation on that.
Artificial, when you say artificial life, what do you mean?
By computer. They're starting to work on that now.
You're talking about artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence, that's right.
You bet they're working on it.
It's artificial intelligence, the wrong word I gave you. Now, von Neumann, I didn't start that project. And a lot of people told me, well, it wasn't time because there was no supercomputers then. Now they can work on that, and they're working on it, artificial intelligence, because a supercomputer is available now, which wasn't available back then. So I think this is some of the developments that are coming up out of this. that new things can be taken, new developments may be taken from that craft. Maybe they can work in now what I said, that the being himself was part of the propulsion system, part of the UFO himself.
Well, that also is interesting because, Dr. Alexander, I'm sure you can confirm, we are beginning to work very seriously now on integration of pilots with our aircraft. They tell us, or I'm told, that there may come a time soon when a pilot will simply think commands for the aircraft. Is that ongoing research?
Well, Firefox is certainly ongoing. I think, however, the next step is to take the pilot out of the aircraft.
And have it be completely robotic.
Correct. What they're calling unmanned aerial vehicles or unmanned, unoccupied combat vehicles.
Well, that's really what the superintelligence did. They took what they were, or their people, out and put a robot or a humanoid in there.
Sounds more like a humanoid. In other words, half machine, half biological entity.
One day I was walking down the hall with General Trudeau, and I told him, General, I think that son of mine is a little bit crazy. He says the engines talk to him. The general stopped. He said, don't say that, Phil, because some people have certain relationships with engine and solid matter which we don't understand yet. Now, this was actually General Trudeau's words to me when I approached him on that subject. So, a racing driver, at times he says he feels like he's part of the racer, of the engine, of the car he's driving.
Right.
You see, these things we don't know too well yet. We haven't lived. And I think that in the book where I say that the UFO was an electromagnetic thing, and the EB, or the extraterrestrial, was part of that aircraft, of that UFO.
An integral part of it.
He was a propulsion system, an integral part of it. This is what we're talking about now.
Do you think those bodies are still at Wright-Patterson?
No, because the lab said that they faded very fast. Their composition, I think, we didn't study it enough, really. We should have. And that was partially I blame myself for, because I could have carried that on and I didn't do it.
In other words, the disposition of the bodies, that was in your hands, Colonel?
Well, I could have, at the time...
You could have followed up.
I could have followed it up and done something and made them study more with what they had before the things all deteriorated to the point where we couldn't work on them anymore or look at them.
The Air Force recently, of course, at the 50th anniversary of Roswell, or just prior to it, had a big news conference, and they disclaimed the whole thing once again. How did you react when you saw that, Colonel?
Well...
Sadness?
I can't conceive what they're thinking. I can't conceive why they're doing that. It's beyond me. And it's like I told most of the newsmen, I wouldn't criticize the sister service. I fought with them in Korea. I had a lot of friends in the Air Force, and I won't criticize them. And I told them, please, gentlemen, don't ask me to criticize. But their superiors, I can't even conceive or why they did something like this. And I made the statement, if I'd have done something like that, I think General Trudeau would have thrown me out the top window of the Pentagon.
We thought we were done, but Colonel Corso said, got to tell you about Albuquerque.
Yes. Art, this concerns you.
Me? Okay.
I went in the bookstore, and there were 300 people there. And they set up a microphone. I had to talk to them. And at least a dozen women came up to me and said they'd heard your show. And they said, and Art, well, he sounded happy, real happy and pleased. I told him, well, I'm going to let him know that. And then an elder woman came up to me. She was not in the line. And she had heard your show, and she said she was in her sick bed. And got up out of her sick bed to come over and shake hands with me. And when she told me she got out of sick bed, she was leaning over and I was sitting down, and I reached up and hugged her. And she kissed me in the cheek and started to cry. So I figured it was all worthwhile right there.
Colonel, I understand.
And she heard your show, too. And they praised you, Art, so I want you to know that.
Colonel,
I opened at Albuquerque at the bookstore.
Well, thank you. Where do you go from here?
I'm going home tomorrow.
Going home.
Sit in my easy chair for a while.
Well, it's an incredible thing that you have done, sir, for us, for our country, for the history books. And I personally want to thank you.
Well, thanks, and I think we're all part of it, so are you, Art. And I hope it works out, and I hope we keep making improvements and stay a great country. Some of the things we did there I haven't told you about that should be done that they stopped us from doing. And sometime we'll talk about those too.
All right, Colonel.
Yes. Well, thank you, Art.
Thank you so much, and Dr. Alexander, thank you.
Okay, good night now.
Well,
Good
thank
night.
you, Art.
Good night, gentlemen. There you have it, and I'm going to leave it up to you, ladies and gentlemen, to digest what you have just heard. Colonel Corso's an 82-year-old man. We have confirmed, Dr. Alexander has confirmed, and believe me, he has the resources to do that the colonel was exactly where he said he was, in the position he said he was in. And you've heard his story. What do you think? It's very hard to turn to anything that would seem more urgent, more important, of greater gravity than what you just heard. And what you just heard, if you listened carefully, was an honorable, simple man who acquired and worked with alien artifacts, saw himself alien bodies, and is saying exactly, in my opinion, what he believes to be true.
UFOs are as real as the airplanes that fly over your head.
According to the former minister, it wasn't inside knowledge from his cabinet days that made him a believer. It was reading Philip Corso's book, The Day After Roswell. A book that investigates the crash of a flying saucer in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico, back in July 1947.
The secrecy involved in all matters pertaining to the Roswell incident was unparalleled. The classification was, from the outset, above top secret. So the vast majority of U.S. officials and politicians, let alone a mere allied Minister of Defense, were never in the loop.
Paul called a former U.S. Army general to ask him if he believed the facts in the book were true, and he said,
"Every word of it is true and more."
The people at this symposium believe that rather than fearing aliens, we should look for ways to benefit from them.
If these things are coming from where they are coming from, meaning light years away, it means they found out that there's a propulsion system, a very, very arcane propulsion system that they're using to travel at or beyond the speed of light. And if we can get a hold of this technology through our interaction with these people, and if our government will come forward and let us talk about this disclosure, we may be able to get a hold of an energy source and a technology that could really help solve a lot of the world's problems.
Let me close by switching from the real to the hypothetical. Last Christmas I had the pleasure, actually, of reviewing a delightful little book entitled Exopolitics, Politics, Government, and Law in the Universe by Alfred Weber. Weber postulates a universe that includes many planets sustaining life more advanced than our own, all subject to universal government based on the rule of law. Earth, he suggests, is an exception. Rather than being the center of the universe, as our ancestors believed, we are the black sheep of the interplanetary community. We have been quarantined and isolated from the, quote, highly organized, interplanetary, intergalactic, multidimensional universe society, end of quote. Presumably because our culture has been strongly influenced by rogue planetary leadership personified in the story of the Garden of Eden. To end the quarantine, Earthlings must advance morally and spiritually while reestablishing connection with interplanetary society. Until recently, we didn't have the technology to do the latter. But increasingly, we do. Meanwhile, visits from our planetary neighbors present opportunities for peaceful communication and collaboration. People who believe in God, as I do, will find nothing in Weber's thesis inconsistent with their belief. Although I admit it is a mighty big mind stretch. His proposal, however, I think is worth considering. He calls it, quote, a decade of contact. And I go on to quote, an era of openness, public hearings, public-funded research, and education about extraterrestrial reality. Who knows? That could be just the antidote the world needs to end its greed-driven, power-centered madness. Thank you.
Welcome back. According to my next guest, the truth is out there, actually up there, with our neighbor to the north, Canada. A former Canadian government official is warning we may be on the verge of intergalactic war, saying, quote, the Bush administration has finally agreed to let the military build a forward base on the moon, which will put them in a better position to keep track of the comings and goings of visitors from space, and to shoot at them if they so decide, end quote. Paul Hellyer is a former Minister of Defense and Deputy Prime Minister of the country of Canada. He joins us now from Toronto. Mr. Hellyer, thanks a lot for coming on.
Not at all. It's a pleasure.
Now, you were the Minister of Defense of Canada when you occupied that position, I believe, under Prime Minister Lester Pearson. Did you come across any classified information that suggested UFOs were real?
No, not really. We got regular reports that showed that some of them were, in fact, unidentified. Some of the sightings could not be explained as natural phenomenon, but nothing more than that.
Well, as you know, there's been this debate for years over whether or not they are real. Most people don't think they are real, or most people at least are hesitant to say they believe they're real in public. What convinced you that they do in fact exist?
Well, for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been looking at the evidence and assessing it much as, I guess, a judge would, and trying to determine who was telling the truth and who wasn't. And I finally concluded, especially after reading a book called The Day After Roswell, written by Colonel Philip Corso, that unidentified flying objects are in fact real as the airplanes flying over your head, and that there has been a monumental cover-up for more than half a century. This is after looking at a lot of evidence and trying to discern who was telling the truth and who wasn't, and I have concluded unequivocally that the people who claim that they have either seen UFOs or have seen classified documents about UFOs or have seen wreckage from the crash at Roswell on or about July the 4th of 1947 are the ones who are telling the truth. And consequently, I'm basing my my policy considerations on that.
Where did you come across this information that the Bush administration is building a forward base on the moon? And why would they do that? And why would they keep it from the public?
Well, to answer your second question first, I don't know. That is the reason I'm raising the question.
Right. Well, how do you that's an awfully specific claim. I haven't read it in the New York Times. Doesn't mean it's not true. Doesn't mean you're wrong. But I'm interested to know why you think that.
Well, because this was forecast in Colonel Corso's book. They were wanting to build a base on the moon as far back as 1964. And General Arthur Trudeau, same name as one of my bosses, was very determined to build a forward base on the moon and prepared all of the specifications necessary for it and the blueprints and so on.
Well, pardon me, I don't mean to interrupt you, but doesn't this make sense? I mean, if in fact there are extraterrestrials and they're buzzing our planet, why wouldn't we want to take steps to defend ourselves from them should they turn hostile?
Well, I think the critical question is whether or not they're hostile. You see, when the crash first occurred, General Nathan Twining
in Roswell
later became, after that crash occurred, he declared that they were enemy alien. Now, there's no evidence that I have seen that would really convince me that they are, in fact, enemy. And what I would like to know is whether that classification of enemy alien still exists or whether it doesn't. And if it exists, what the evidence is on which the United States government bases its conclusion. I think that's tremendously important.
I think that's an entirely fair question. Now, finally, you laid out these views in September of this year at a speech at the University of Toronto. And according to the news report I have of the speech, your address, quote, ended with a standing ovation. And that implies, I think, that your views are commonplace in Canada. They're a minority view here, a distinct minority view. Do you think most Canadians believe that there is a forward base under construction on the moon and that aliens are buzzing the Earth?
No, absolutely not. Most of them are skeptics. Most of them haven't spent much time researching the subject, and so I think the average here would be very similar to the average American. And I'm hoping that maybe we can persuade the Canadian Senate to hold hearings and listen to some of the 400 witnesses that your Dr. Stephen, what's his name? Greer, Dr. Stephen Greer, has compiled, and hear them and make up their minds as to whether or not there is a real threat.
All right.
And maybe this would be just enough to push the American government, the U.S. Congress or Senate, into holding its own hearings, and then getting the United States government finally to come clean and tell us what they're worried about.
Okay. Canada's former Minister of Defense, Paul Hellyer. If you're right, history will record you as a visionary. If you're wrong, well, I'm glad you came on anyway. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
In addition to requests for press interviews, I have been inundated with new material of all kinds: books, theses, articles, leaked documents, formerly classified information obtained under the Freedom of Information Acts, etc. I probably have enough reading material to last me for the rest of my natural days. So I guess I hope I stick around for a while and get through as much of it as possible. Consequently, I am fast becoming an expert at sifting the wheat from the chaff. Some of the material is just pure junk. Some of it is quite intriguing fiction, plausible to an extent, but ultimately failing the litmus test of credibility. Some of the prophecy and dire predictions of malicious ET interference in the lives of humans is fear-mongering of the worst possible kind, the sort of falsity that creates fear in the minds of the populace. This is exactly what the military-industrial complex hopes for in order to rally public support for their plans. On the other hand, much of the material is pure gold, including a number of very excellent books. One I recommend is Alien Agenda by Jim Marrs. It covers a lot of territory: the titillating thesis that the moon may have been placed in orbit by intelligent beings, UFO crashes, abductions, eye-to-eye encounters, cattle mutilations, crop circles, remote viewing, and much more. And presents a very balanced view in each case. Marrs gives the proponents and the debunkers almost equal time. It doesn't require too much discernment, however, to decide who is telling the truth and who isn't. A very recent book, Magic Eyes Only, by Ryan S. Wood, is equally compelling. Wood documents 74 UFO crashes from 1897, would you believe, from 1897 to the present. And while the evidence is much stronger in some of the cases than in others, there is more than enough to convince an unbiased reader that, as the Dust Jacket states, first, UFOs have crashed on Earth. Second, governments have recovered and exploited these alien technology gifts. And third, most disturbing to a democratic free society, the alien secret is more important than constitutional or individual rights. And this is something that interests me and disturbs me greatly. To understand this damning indictment, it is important to know the framework of our so-called democratic systems. And so I would like to talk about the permanent and the provisional governments. Lewis Lapham, editor of Harper's Magazine and one of America's great liberal thinkers, contends that the United States has two governments, the permanent and the provisional. He summed up his definition of the former in one sentence. It's a long sentence, mind you, but in one sentence, as part of his On Politics, Culture, and the Media keynote address to the Canadian Institute of International Affairs National Foreign Policy Conference in October 1996. And I quote Lewis Lapham, "The permanent government is the secular oligarchy that comprises the Fortune 500, the big media and entertainment syndicates, the civil and military services, the large research universities and law firms." And then he puts his thesis in historical context. Just as the Catholic Church was the predominant institution in medieval Europe, and the Roman legion the most efficient manifestation of organized force in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC, so also the transnational corporation arranges the affairs of the late 20th, and I might add early 21st century. The American Congress and the American President serve at the pleasure of their commercial overlords, all of whom hold firmly to the belief that all government regulation is wicked, that is, the work of the devil, and that any impulse that runs counter to this manly interest of business is, by definition, soft, effeminate, and liberal. In other words, the interests of ordinary citizens take second place to those of the industrial and military elite. Often, when I'm speaking on other subjects, I use Lapham's thesis. I paraphrase it a little bit. See, Lapham says there are two governments, permanent and provisional. The first consists of the Fortune 500, the big law firms in Washington that do their legal work, the big public relations firms that do their public relations, or in some cases propaganda if you prefer, and the top civil servants, both civil and military. And then I paraphrase, every few years we have a charade called an election. And the permanent government picks the actors to go on stage and read their scripts. And they try to pick actors that won't improvise too much. Don't want to mention any names in particular. And then, through the Trilateral Commission, in which many of them are represented, they raise the money to get their candidates elected and no one else need apply. And that's the way the system works. And as I'm sure you know, I think the Trilateral Commission has picked every president but one in the last, 30 or 40 years, something like that. Well, it is a very small but extremely powerful slice of that permanent oligarchy which has become the custodian of the alien secret. It is a policy that began immediately following the 1947 crash at Roswell, or the two crashes which appear to have been the case as reported by Ryan Wood. It is my belief that it was the danger implicit in having the secret in the wrong hands that prompted General Eisenhower to warn us over half a century ago to beware of the military and industrial complex.
When my dad first became president, he came in at the real beginning of the thermonuclear age.
I think we have to put the 1950s into perspective. We look back today and we think the 1950s was a period of Elvis Presley and poodle skirts. But in fact, it was a very dangerous period of time.
Defense budgets throughout the Western world doubled or tripled in the 4 years between 48 and 52.
The Soviets are outproducing America's aircraft factories.
There is a threat, but we can't measure how much is enough defense spending to stop the Soviet Union. So by the time Eisenhower is president, there is a huge new flow of cash into defense industries.
He was the first to acknowledge that a permanent military establishment would be required during this period, but then unless we could find some kind of breakthrough, that in fact it would end up creating a terrible cost.
The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities.
It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals.
We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat.
We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people.
This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron.
My father, as president, had strong guiding principles. He used to say, modern weapons take food from the hungry and shelter from the homeless. And so he was fighting with the Pentagon all the time for asking for too much and Congress for giving it to him.
I don't believe we should pay 1 cent for defense more than we have to.
Well, Eisenhower saw us starting to build program after program that was just out of control. And his own ability to shape national security policy was being hemmed in by these forces he couldn't control, and he was the president.
On at least one occasion, Eisenhower was heard to say by those in the room, "God help this country when somebody sits at this desk who doesn't know as much about the military as I do."
My fellow Americans, this evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
You have to realize this is one of the great presidents, great military leaders. On his way out the door, at the end of his second term, he says, by the way, watch out for the military-industrial complex.
People know that he invented the phrase military-industrial complex, but very rarely do you see the whole thing and realize how utterly strident his warning was. I think it's one of the most profound statements ever made by an American president.
Just like George Washington gave his warnings about foreign entanglements and things like that, my dad was giving his warning against letting this military-industrial complex get out of hand.
We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
It is my belief that it was the danger implicit in having this secret in the wrong hands that prompted General Eisenhower to warn us over half a century ago to beware of the military-industrial complex. Not only has the alien secret been closely guarded, it has been ruthlessly enforced. In Magic Eyes Only, Ryan Wood describes a document, apparently authentic, labeled SOM-1-01, an extraterrestrial entities and technology recovery and disposal manual, dated April 1954. As Wood points out, the manual provides strict instructions concerning the, quote, need for absolute secrecy in all phases of operation, end of quote. And then adds, including a press blackout. I quote, great care must be taken to preserve the security of any location where extraterrestrial technology might be retrievable for scientific study. Extreme measures must be taken to protect and preserve any material or craft from discovery, examination, or removal by civilian agencies or individuals of the general public. It should be remembered when selecting a cover story that official policy regarding UFOBs is that they do not exist. The most desirable response would be that nothing unusual has occurred. Witnesses will be discouraged from talking about what they have seen, and intimidation may be necessary to ensure their cooperation. If witnesses have already contacted the press, it will be necessary to discredit their stories. This can best be done by the assertion that they have misinterpreted natural events, are the victims of hysteria or hallucinations, or are the perpetrators of hoaxes. End of quote. Well, doesn't that sound all too familiar? It is the story of the last half-century. Official duplicity aided and abetted by a tame and compliant press. It is a policy that has made liars of some of America's most respected citizens and kept the majority in near total ignorance of the facts. It is doubtful that a single member of the Congress is in the loop concerning the alien secret. And if that is not correct, let him or her stand up and state the truth. Meanwhile, the Congress is voting funds for projects it is unaware of. This has to be an abdication of its role as protector of the public purse. Those of us who believe in the concept of government of, by, and for the people may be forgiven for suggesting that before the U.S. assumes the mantle of democratic initiator for the world, it would be expedient to enforce its own constitution and the rights it guarantees for its own citizens.
The time has come to lift the veil of secrecy and let the truth emerge so there can be a real and informed debate about one of the most important problems facing our planet today.
You realize, if this seems like you're saying you are for disclosure, if you're for disclosure, do you realize it's like pulling the rug under from out of a lot of institutions that are well established, including the financial, the religious, the political institutions, and that is the excuse a lot of people have been using for keeping the secret secret. How would you deal with that?
Well, I believe in seeking the truth, and in the good book it says if you seek the truth, it'll make you free. And I don't think there's any other approach. I don't think you can live a lie. I'm a religious person. I'm not the least bit concerned about disclosure. And I'm absolutely determined that we find out what the truth is. And I think it's just natural and inevitable that there are other species elsewhere in the galaxy or galaxies that are more advanced technologically than we are, and probably morally and spiritually as well, and that we should cooperate with them and learn from them and work together to I'm used to saying make a better world. Well, we'll start by trying to make our world better, but maybe we can cooperate in making a better galaxy or galaxies, and that these are the kinds of projects and policies that we should be adopting.